Okay, good afternoon. So today is World Water Day, but yesterday was actually the International Day of Forests, if you didn't know, which gives a little bit of justification of why our project is particularly focused on the forest-agriculture interface. And we are particularly interested in the topic of food security. Like Craig said, it's all about quantifying linkages, not just identifying linkages. And we're looking at the linkages between ecosystem services, how ecosystem services contribute to food security and nutritional health, and also recognizing that the pursuit of food security and nutritional health can have an impact on ecosystem services. So people will cut down forests to have agricultural space, for example, and that has a negative impact on those people who may be more reliant on the forest for their particular food security. So there are trade-offs happening all the time. And this diagram tries to show some of the complexity just in a very summarized form. So various different ecosystems. We're looking particularly at the forest, as I said, producing all sorts of different types of services, some of which are a direct contribution to food. For example, non-timber forest products that can include game or wild harvested fruit and nuts can be directly eaten, but they can also have an indirect contribution by being sold for income, which people can then use to buy food. And a lot of these services provide an indirect contribution to food via agriculture, as pollinating services, for example, water for agriculture, mulch, and so on. And there may be trade-offs between these. You cannot necessarily keep harvesting biomass from your forest and still have a habitat for pollinators or still have the same quantity and quality of water. So there are trade-offs happening at this level of the different services from an ecosystem. There are also trade-offs happening here at the beneficiary end, because communities are not just a homogeneous group of people, but they consist of different individuals who may have more or less power in a household, different households who may be more or less able to access some of the ecosystem services, and communities that may also differ. And then there's also the issue of looking at internal drivers that lead to change, which are under the control, if you like, or more under the control of communities, maybe how they manage particular resources, for example. And then the exogenous drivers that are very important to highlight, which may include natural drivers like drought, but can also be policies from government. A logging concession being put in a forest near you, for example, may reduce the amount of ecosystem services that you can get. So it's a very complex issue and requires an interdisciplinary approach. So we have a very large team from the UK, from the US, Conservation International, Spain. Our modelling Supremo is in Spain, though a lot of the modelling is being done here as well. We have partners in Colombia, one of whom will be talking to us later. And then our partners also in Malawi and in South Africa. And we cover the disciplines and different types of organisation as well. Our study areas at the moment are in Colombia and in Malawi. The Colombia site is almost completely forested with very low deforestation levels. Our Malawi site is at the other end of the forest transition, where pretty much deforestation has gone as far as it's going to get, and people are beginning to start planting trees on their private land, so you're getting into replenishment. And we're looking at identifying a third site that has kind of a 50% deforestation rate to understand this transition a little bit better. And our methodological framework, we've got a large number of different methodologies, both social sciences and natural sciences, and they're linked in this DIPSIR framework, which looks at drivers and pressures, how that affects the state of the resource, the impacts on people, and then the responses, very important to improve policy, to try and change the situation, and making sure that this is done at different spatial and different temporal scales. So our first research theme is understanding the drivers and pressures, looking at the direct and indirect contributions of ecosystem services in our two case study sites. And here's an example of what that looks like in practice. We've been using a lot of participatory methods. So in a pilot village, our participatory methods on well-being well-being rankings showed us that about 70% of the population were poor and very poor, and they were the ones that were most dependent on ecosystem services for rain-fed agriculture, for example, for consuming wild vegetables and bushmeat and fish and crabs, also using and selling firewood, so very dependent on ecosystem services for their food security. They're very much under pressure from environmental and socioeconomic drivers. They recognize both being important. So we have the population growth, but you also have the erratic rains, changing climate, which just makes things much harder. There's less available land, there's no room to spread out, no possibility of rotating land because there's no spare land available. There's very few farm inputs for livestock, for example. And all of that means that the impacts on people, there's destitution, there's a regular hungry season every year, there's malnutrition. One of the coping strategies that women in that area use is prostitution, which links to HIV problems, and there's also depletion of natural resources. So some of the responses available at the moment are government subsidies, changing management, various development interventions like tree planting, ponds, fish ponds and irrigation, and we hope that the information we provide will allow these responses to be better and more appropriate. In addition to the participatory work, we're doing a lot of household surveys where we'll also be doing food diaries and really understanding what kind of products people use for food and how they deal with food shortages at different times of the year. So we'll be doing it at 3 times of the year, different seasons. And then based on what's happening now, we then look at what happens in the future, trying to look at, what happens in a crisis, tipping points, and how do we start planning for future scenarios. And that's our second research theme. And for future scenarios, you need to do a bit of modeling. And there are quite a lot of models out there. Craig showed a great number. We found that people are particularly using at the moment, based on our current findings, water-based ecosystem services and forest-based ecosystem services. And there are separate models for all of these out there, but we hadn't yet really found anything that manages to integrate them all together. And that's what we hope to do using ARES, which is a modeling platform that allows you to bring different models together. It's quite unique because it uses Bayesian statistics, which attaches uncertainties or likelihoods to particular scenarios. It's also unique in that it doesn't just show the provision, but it also shows the use and the flow of different ecosystem services. So if you've got a village landscape, here you've got forest areas which are all mapped by the villages, you've got rivers, the actual location of the houses, and a road, which is a very important route for ecosystem services to flow in and out. And then you can see that a lot of your flows are concentrated in one area, one geographically spatial area, so that may be an important area for future planning. So planning brings us to our third theme, which is about the science policy interface and trying to make the information available to policymakers to make the right kind of level of information available to them. And here's an example of how risk management can be done using a bow tie framework. In a normal, well-functioning ecosystem, you've got your firewood, which can be sold or can be used for cooking directly. But you can have over-collection, which then leads to not enough firewood, and a consequence is decreased food security. So there's 2 ways of tackling that. You can either go for the prevention approach, perhaps a new community-based institution that manages the resource better, and you can also go for the management of the consequence at the end, so perhaps providing food aid if people are hungry or charcoal if they've run out of fuel wood. So overall then, we're trying to provide better information to policymakers to improve their resource management with a view to achieving better food security and nutritional health. And it's a question of providing the right type of information that suits decision makers at different levels. And with that transparency, we also hope to make sure that decisions at the end are fairer and more equitable for all the stakeholders involved.